Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the international conference Ocean That Belongs to All, organized by Clube Lisboa. I'm Ricardo Alexandre, TSF Radio News journalist. I'm going to moderate this panel with the Portuguese National Defense Minister João Gomes Cravinho, Leendert Bal, Head of Security Protection and Surveillance Department of the European Maritime Safety Agency, the EMSA, Kaitlin Meredith, Program Coordinator on Maritime Crime at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and Timothy Walker, Maritime Project Leader and Senior Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. I salute you all and thank everyone for your presence. There is simultaneous translation for the audience available only at the conference link on Zoom, but you can direct your questions to the panelists both on Zoom and on YouTube. The name of this panel is on unsafe waters. We know that there have been changes to the security context in the Atlantic. I begin by asking the Minister of National Defense, João Gomes Cravinho, what diagnosis can be made? How do you read these new challenges coming from the Atlantic?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon to my co-panelists, Leendert Bal and Kaitlin Meredith, Timothy Walker. Good afternoon, Ricardo Alexandre. Good afternoon to all who are in the public. A few words then about the new security context of the Atlantic. And I'm afraid they are not going to be very optimistic words. We have, of course, the Atlantic as one of the most important economic regions of the planet, and this has consequences. All of the world's major economies are present in the Atlantic. The main military players are also present, and they're increasingly present. There are important energy reserves. We have a very high intensity of maritime traffic and a very high intensity of underwater sea lines of communication. From a Portuguese perspective, there are two other aspects that are of major strategic relevance. The Atlantic is home to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and of course, it's also home to various of our Portuguese-speaking countries, Brazil, Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, and so we have also an important community there. And this means that on our side, we are certainly highly committed to any mechanisms that can improve forms of safeguarding the global commons that we all benefit from. Now, what's changing in the Atlantic? Firstly, we have the return of significant geopolitical competition. The Atlantic has been very quiet. It has been a very stable region in the past few decades due to a reduced level of strategic rivalry, especially in the North Atlantic, where Europeans and North Americans have been allies in NATO. 20 years or so ago, beginning of the century, the emergence of the BRICS began to change the cooperative dynamics. Two of the BRICS, of course, are South Atlantic powers, Brazil and South Africa. But above all, the tremendous emergence of China as a commercial power has introduced very significant changes. China's increasing presence in Latin America and in Africa implies an increasing presence in the Atlantic. And then we have also, of course, the melting of the Arctic and the illegal occupation of Crimea, both of which have given Russia new and easier routes of access to the Atlantic. At the same time, we have changing global geopolitical patterns with increased competition. And so what this means is that the Atlantic is likely to be one of the regions that is increasingly contested geopolitically. So the strategic lines of communication, be they commercial ones or underwater lines, will be increasingly challenged. Russia's military investments suggest strongly that it aims to have a more assertive military presence in the Atlantic. We also know that Russia has a predisposition or preference for asymmetric means, which also has impacts. And China is, of course, building what will become at some point, in the not too distant future, the world's largest navy. So, and of course, the Atlantic is part of the planning for use of that Navy. If we add to this context unresolved tensions between NATO allies, what we have is an intensification of negative tendencies for the Atlantic. And so that means at the outset that it is particularly important to have a renewal of the transatlantic dialogue at the same time as we have progress in terms of European strategic autonomy. There is at least two other aspects attached to increased competition for resources. One is an intensification of the claims about the areas of responsibility of coastal states, about their continental shelves, which can trigger frontier disputes. Another aspect relates to illegal exploitation of resources belonging to states that don't have the capacity to police and to protect their own waters. Piracy, we'll probably discuss this more further, is one of the biggest threats to the commercial flows, of course, and the Gulf of Guinea has become by far the major worldwide focus of piracy, with 95% of attacks in 2020 worldwide taking place in the Gulf of Guinea. And just a few years ago, the Gulf of Guinea represented less than half of worldwide attacks. Last year, 2020, about 130 sailors were kidnapped, compared to 39 in 2019 in the Gulf of Guinea. So what we should be worried about is not only each one of these dynamics, but also the convergence between these different dynamics. For example, the convergence between drug trafficking, which involves South America as a producer, Africa as a staging post, Europe and North America as consumer markets, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the financing of terrorism in the Sahel. And of course, these dynamics involving drug trafficking are extremely corrosive of state structures, with the risk of state capture by organized crime. Only complex responses, of course, are capable of being effective responses, which involve both control of the markets of illicit goods and supply and demand, as well as repression capacity to repress the trade itself at sea. All of these dynamics have a negative impact upon the peace and stability of Atlantic societies, and therefore upon the ocean itself. And just like piracy, these dynamics are facilitated by a lack of common situational awareness and by insufficient means for dissuasion and deterrence. So by identifying those problems, lack of common situational awareness and insufficient means for dissuasion and deterrence, of course, we are also identifying solutions, means of compensating for the increasing problems. So we have a growing requirement for concerted Atlantic-wide action, in which the military dimension will have to be present, but also there will have to be a greater political understanding of the negative externalities that affect the whole Atlantic region. And I would say a greater shared political understanding. A few words just on climate change and pollution, other factors of negative dynamics. The melting of the Arctic region has significant geopolitical and strategic impact because of the identification of new resources, the development of new access routes, and also the rise of sea levels for coastal states. We have a greater impact of extreme weather events, which again strongly impacts coastal communities. On the positive side, developments in space technology can help us to monitor and forecast and to develop appropriate humanitarian responses. But of course, these are responses to something negative that is already happening. Pollution, unsustainability of natural resources also affects the subsistence of communities. The so-called blue economy, which is one of the most hopeful possibilities for the world, requires much greater coordination, much greater control in the use of sea resources, and it requires better mechanisms for imposing respect for state sovereignty of coastal communities. So we have a wide set of dynamics that are all converging, all happening simultaneously, and all pointing to an increased geopolitical centrality of the Atlantic and increasingly a contestation of the Atlantic. So the peace and quiet of the last few decades, unfortunately, I suspect will not continue in the next few decades. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Ricardo, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your intervention. We'll come back to you later on. I would like to ask the other panelists if someone wants to add a comment on this intervention. Leendert?
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much, first of all, of having me in the panel, and also good afternoon to my panelists. If I may, I have a remark or a question to the Minister. I enjoyed very much his introduction. He mentioned the Gulf of Guinea and the issue of piracy. As you can imagine, the EU ship owners, they are struggling a lot with this security threat in the Gulf of Guinea. It's very problematic. He rightly also mentioned the growing number of hijackings of crew in this region. I know that, of course, at the moment, and that is always a great adventure, Portugal has the presidency of the European Union. At the moment, there's a discussion on the coordinated maritime presence, which is a kind of new security concept. I think Portugal is chairing the pilot for the Gulf of Guinea. And I think it would be very interesting, and I think it would also be hope, not only negative, but also hope. And for that, I wish also the Minister a lot of luck during his presidency to make something out of it, because I think there are really big needs in improving security in this region. And I hope that we can find an umbrella by which the European Union can increase its presence in this region, where also from our side, European Maritime Safety Agency, we are very much willing to contribute to the success of this new pilot. So I don't know if the Minister can say some words on this new initiative, because that would be of high interest. Thank you very much.
We will come back to the issue of Gulf of Guinea and the priorities of the Portuguese presidency regarding the maritime safety and sea issues. But let me move on to the first presentations of the other panelists, and I will start with you, Leendert. The first word that comes to my mind when I think about the Mediterranean at this point is tragedy, but it could be hope if European countries agreed on a common policy to tackle this common tragedy. Fortunately, as far as I read today, 77 asylum seekers were adrift on board in a boat in Malta's search and rescue region, have been rescued and taken to Lampedusa. An NGO called Alarm Phone announced it on Twitter that all individuals on board arrived in good health, including a newborn baby was among the group. These happy end stories are not so common in the Mediterranean, as we all know. I would ask you to tell us a bit about the most pressing and current security challenges in the Mediterranean. The floor is yours for the next 5 minutes or so.
Thank you very much. And indeed, you immediately mentioned one of them. I prepared a few slides just to illustrate the threats that I want to shortly introduce. So I hope that the organizers can show it. Yes. So if you go to the next slide, you will see it's a bit of an overview of the threats that we see in the Mediterranean Sea. So please, can you turn to the next slide? Yes, this is the one. Typically, and of course this is not exhaustive, human trafficking is an important issue, a security challenge. Narcotics trafficking from different sides, also tobacco smuggling. Arms trafficking in the Mediterranean Sea is also a big issue. So unfortunately, this tragedy also has a bit of a dark side, which I want to shortly illustrate with a couple of slides. Indeed, it's a big area. It's a semi-enclosed sea, so it's also vulnerable. I took security a bit in a narrow approach, but of course, also the Minister mentioned pollution, and certainly also pollution in the Mediterranean Sea is an important issue. And as the sea water is not refreshed at the same rate as, for example, in the Atlantic, also the environmental impact is even bigger in the Mediterranean than in big oceans. And also there, of course, we have a criminal side to pollution, tank washing, but also waste dumping, even waste dumping for money, which also happens in the Mediterranean. But let me just have a quick word on some of those threats. So if I may go to my next slide, please. I will start indeed with human trafficking, irregular migration, as just illustrated by our host and moderator. It's a big issue. So here you see the reported trafficking victims, but of course the number of people trying to move into the European Union are much higher and much bigger. Unfortunately, there is a business model behind. There are people that make money out of trying to bring people across the Mediterranean Sea, whether successful or not. And that is rather shameful, because also a lot of accidents happened, also fatal accidents. So this is unfortunately one of the big strategies of the last years, where of course in 2014-15 it was at its heights, but still even today, as just illustrated, there is still the problem of irregular migration, which is also linked to criminal activity, as people make money out of bringing people into the European Union. If I go to another type of threat that we have, maybe a bit less known, is tobacco smuggling, certainly also from the East Med. Sometimes it's seen as a kind of easy way to make money. Risks are a bit lower than with other illegal activities, and money made by smuggling tobacco is then again sometimes reinvested in other activities, for example, in buying and selling arms, also in the region. Also here, sometimes as an agency, you just see the picture below, we also give support to enforcement bodies that try to undermine and intercept these type of illegal business transportations in the Mediterranean Sea. And it looks rather innocent. Maybe a lot of people stopped smoking, and I hope you all did. But it is a big problem, and we are talking about quite a big number of cigarettes that are being smuggled into the EU. Of course, more dangerous than cigarettes, that's on my next slide, are narcotics. Here you see, for example, interception of a vessel that was carrying cannabis, which was intercepted by the French customs, and then tried to escape from showing evidence. They put the ship on fire. But it's a big issue. Unfortunately, Europe is a big consumer market of all types of narcotics, and there are big profit margins. So a lot of people also in the North African side, they try to smuggle narcotics into the EU. Some of those narcotics are coming from South America via West Africa to the EU. So there are different routes being used to bring in narcotics into the EU, which also a lot happens in the Mediterranean. We have some typical hotspots. For example, the border area between Morocco and Algiers is a well-known departure area for fast speedboats that bring narcotics into the European Union, and there are more places like that. So there's also one of the threats that there are, and of course, as Europe maybe going into an economic depression, but unfortunately still spends a lot of money on narcotics, it remains a problem. You see some figures here illustrated by our sister agency here in Lisbon, N, who deals with the interception of narcotic transportation. Going more to states and tensions there, I think we are on the right track. Also in the past, there have been quite some quarrels between coastal states in the Mediterranean Sea regarding their EEZs. For a long time, there was a problem between Croatia and Slovenia, for example, in the Adriatic Sea, Fortunately, this has been solved by an arbitration case. But also around Italy, Malta, Tunisia, Libya, sometimes there are still issues. And again, when oil and gas is being found, or there's a prospect of finding oil and gas, also those tensions are being raised again. For example, as you may recall from the news, not that long ago, there was this Turkish exploration ship coming close to Cyprus. It also created a lot of tensions and also put a lot of tension on NATO. Even also Greek Navy ships were also in the vicinity of that exploration ship. Of course, having states in turmoil also does not help. Still, we have the conflict in Libya ongoing. We have the war in Syria. Those type of conflicts, again, also generate arms trafficking. And also the Mediterranean Sea are also used for arms trafficking, even into the Black Sea, to the Crimea area. So there are still also from, let's say, state security problems, states in turmoil or states that are not stable. There are security threats also in the Mediterranean Sea. And on top of that, as I already mentioned, we have also the environmental issues that I mentioned shortly. That's also an issue. So unfortunately, the treasure that Ricardo referred to is still very beautiful. But with this dark side, I think you have a pretty good indication of what kind of threats we have in the Mediterranean Sea. So I would like to keep it to that in my first intervention. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Leendert. Now let's move east, far east. Kaitlin Meredith, I think your first intervention will focus on the Malacca Strait. So, please.
All right, I hope you can all see my screen now, and thank you very much for the introduction, Minister and co-panelists. I'm very happy to be here with you, and we'll be focusing on what's happening in Southeast Asia, in that region, and focusing specifically on the ASEAN region. By its very nature and geography, it is a maritime region. 9 out of the 10 ASEAN states are coastal states, and 2 of them are archipelagic states, with Indonesia has over 17,000 islands and Philippines over 7,000. So you can imagine the task of ensuring maritime law enforcement. A very significant percentage of the big population in Southeast Asia is a coastal population, and they have historical and economic ties to the sea. ASEAN states are relatively rich compared to many other regions in the world. There are no low-income countries in ASEAN, and that affects their ability to respond to some of the crimes. However, like many regions in the world, the prosperity is not evenly felt, and it is particularly coastal communities that are disproportionately poor compared to capital regions. The blue economy is very important in the region, specifically issues of fishing, tourism, and shipping. And the maritime spaces are typically very busy with vessels, which again can cause a challenge to maritime law enforcement. Most states in the region do have a fairly professional and well-equipped maritime law enforcement capacity. And there are a number of existing multilateral or cooperation mechanisms in the region, first and foremost ASEAN, but also more operational centers such as the Maritime Information Fusion Center with dedicated liaison officers, and RECAP that focuses specifically on the issue of piracy. I'll therefore just go to the next slide, which looks a bit more specifically at the Malacca Strait, as well as some of the successes that have been found in the responses. So the Malacca and Singapore Strait is one of the key shipping routes globally. It links the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean together, and is a key transportation hub for oil transported from the Middle East to Asia, as well as supporting all of the big producers in that part of the world. It is a natural choke point geographically, and is also lined with a number of inlets and islands, and makes it very easy to hide and escape. For that reason, it's for decades and decades been a really hot spot for piracy. In response, there have been some good initiatives. The coastal states, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, supported also by Thailand in 2004, set up a Malacca Straits patrol. And this provides for coordinated maritime patrols, as well as air patrols, as well as information exchange. So here you can see some of the differences from what the Minister was describing, the lack of common situational awareness and means for dissuasion. It's a little bit different here in the Malacca Straits. There have been a few spikes of piracy since they've set up this initiative, particularly in 2014 and 15. There were some highly violent attacks against oil tankers where oil was siphoned, but typically the numbers decreased in the sort of 2016 to 18, and then there has been a gradual increase over the last few years. However, the attacks are relatively crimes of opportunity, small groups of men, non-violent attacks, usually for engine parts or cargo or personal property. So it hasn't been a main threat in the region. However, I wanted to just quickly contrast that to the piracy that's happening in the Sulu and Celebes Sea, which is a tri-border area between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. And this region has been plagued with insecurity at the hands of a terrorist organization, Abu Sayyaf, who has been using kidnap for ransom as a way of generating funds for its operations. These are highly organized initiatives, typically also including criminal organizations that might help with the kidnappings. Between 2014 and 2020, there were 30 vessels that were attacked and persons kidnapped for ransom. The organization Stable Seas thinks that over $14 million was generated through ransom payments for this organization. Again, there have been some fairly good responses in the region. There has been a trilateral cooperation agreement set up between the 3 coastal states. And this is in spite of existing contested maritime boundaries between Philippines and Malaysia in that region. So the cooperation typically is complicated in that sort of situation. They've also established protected transit corridors and have taken some innovations such as tagging smaller vessels that don't need to use AIS, so that users of the sea and maritime law enforcers can identify ships or smaller vessels if they happen to be out of place or suspicious. I'll end my initial presentation here. I'd be happy to contribute a bit more on the drugs trafficking phenomenon in the region also, but I'll hand the floor back now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Now let's move to the Indian Ocean. And Timothy Walker, when we speak about the coast of Mozambique at this point, we cannot ignore the fact that the Mozambican state is not in full control of the important, significant areas of that coast and of the inland territory. Is this an important factor to be analyzed when we look at that region?
It really is. When you look at the history of what we might call maritime trade and control in that part of the world, there's never been a lot of what we call state control over particular areas, but the fact that a coastline has effectively been lost to a group or an organization which is not just hostile to states surrounding the region, but is prepared to even at times integrate very limited maritime tactics into its attacks, does raise some really serious questions about the potential safety and security of gas developments in the future, but also of shipping through the Mozambique Channel. And that's something which actually has been a major focus of South African policy. From my angle here, we are based in Pretoria, an inland city, but it's always very useful to sometimes look at the maritime problems from inland when you realize how vulnerable we are to disruptions to trade, if it's in oil or if it's in energy, other energy sources like liquid natural gas. and particularly if it's in terms of merchant shipping and trade and cargo, without safe and secure dependable shipping and the smooth functioning of ports, that would be very difficult to sustain viable societies quite far inland. And it's very prevalent in the Mozambique Channel. The major ports there, such as Beira, are critical linkages to the landlocked states in Southern Africa as well. So when we look at the map and we, for instance, I will just bring up a slide to help illustrate the point. Sorry, bear with me. Just so you can get a full view of what we need to be considering here. If you look at the Mozambique Channel, like say Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and obviously many of the large cities and ports, cities and towns within the region are linked to these port cities in Mozambique, and a huge amount of traffic of relative importance in the sense of that, while maybe not a huge amount in total volume, the fact that these ports are critical to the sustainability of inland ports, inland cities in Southern Africa, is often overlooked. I'm sure many of you have heard or used often the concept of sea blindness, this kind of paradoxical ambivalence towards the prioritization of maritime security, of trying to prevent threats from escalating or from managing them or trying to preempt them at an early stage. Southern Africa, particularly the Indian Ocean, Southwest Indian Ocean, there's no shortage of what you might call regionalism. There's a proliferation of multilateral organizations. To name some, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. There is the regional communities of the African continent as well, such as East African Community or the Southern African Development Community, which I'll touch upon there just now, and some which involve what many states in the region consider external states, such as France. Here in particular, the Indian Ocean Commission, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which involves many states beyond the ones I've just mentioned. The Contact Group for Piracy off the coast of Somalia. There's been a very rich web of interactions between the member states or states which have major interests in safe and secure shipping being uninterrupted in this part of the world. But African states, African involvement, African participation is actually quite minimal. And it's often very hard to explain, like I say, given that the national interest of many states is that there can be as little disruption, especially in a time of COVID, when the vulnerability of and the fragility of so many economies has been illustrated. A useful thing to just look at the map on the left is the very small number of islands in the Mozambique Channel. This creates what you might call a very complex maritime political geography. The disputes, and in Leenderdt's presentation illustrating 3 border disputes or disputes over sovereignty, over resources. Many of these issues lay dormant in this part of the world, but as time goes on, as the value of resources in the sea, if we frame them in terms of the blue economy, as the Minister mentioned as well, if those become more feasible and more viable, but more needed as well, then you will start to see maybe some disputes over sovereignty, ownership, or sharing. These multilateral forums that I've mentioned are ideal setups. Some of them obviously very dedicated to one particular topic, be it the fight against piracy, particularly around 10 years ago. But unfortunately, they're not still well established enough, I think, to bring on the kind of the dependable expectations of security, of trade, of community, which we saw in the previous presentation from Kaitlin around ASEAN. There is, and this is the final thing I'll just say for now, because I think just to leave a little bit and then get back to some of the topics we can discuss in the questions. The Southern African Development Community on March the 3rd is going to have a meeting of its Standing Maritime Committee. Now this is a subcommittee of its main security organ. So it's not a meeting of the heads of state, which would normally have occurred with the what we call the Troika, which in this case would be South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. Mozambique is actually chairing SADC at the moment. The SADC has not necessarily escalated the maritime insecurity which the loss of control over parts of the coastline is causing, and the concern particularly around gas development. But this other committee, when it meets, is going to discuss an integrated maritime security strategy, a revision of its prior approaches. And this is hoped that it will break some of this inertia and become a platform. You might have also seen in recent days the UNODC has spoken around the center in Maputo, which will be established and invigorated to help coordinate the fight against drug trafficking in the area as well. Now, these are all dovetailing with each other, but unfortunately, well, they're intended to dovetail with each other, but for the moment, they're still in silos. And that's, I think, the big problem facing this part of the Indian Ocean and going forward as well, is increasing coordination and cooperation between not just member states, but bringing into the conversation gas companies, as brought up the map there on the right, but also the South African Navy as a crucial actor as well, because it actually has been patrolling there for the last 10 years. On the map on the left, we highlighted Pemba with a small star. The South African Navy has mostly been patrolling around that part of the channel, originally to fight piracy and prevent it spreading south, but it is the potential as well to be involved in maritime security operations. And I think it's a very useful platform for further discussion. And with that, I'd like to hand back to you, Chair, and I look forward to the discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Let's get back to Minister Cravinho and the Gulf of Guinea, considered presently the most dangerous maritime area in the world, taking into account the exponential growth of attacks in the region. And two of the first questions that have already come through the chat are related to that region. Fernando Gomes writes, taking into account the new geopolitical centrality of the Atlantic, are the Portuguese armed forces, namely the Navy and the Air Force, ready to take the challenge? And then Pedro Gonçalves, the coordinated maritime presences project could strengthen maritime policing in the Gulf of Guinea and South Atlantic. Portugal will be prepared as a great promoter of the project to maintain a constant presence in the area. And what feedback are you getting from other European countries about the initiative?
Great. Well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying that I very much enjoyed the presentation of the other three panelists, all of whom point to, on the one hand, an increased level of conflictuality in the oceans, but on the other hand, and contestedness and the appearance of new challenges, but on the other hand, also pre-existing institutional infrastructures, which have not been very active lately, but should need to be re-energized in order to focus on the current challenges. So that is, it's better than starting from nothing. So that's a positive aspect that I think should be underlined, because these pre-existing institutional setups, presumably, I know a little bit about some of them, but less about others, but have been not very operational because of certain levels of disputes, rivalries, and so on, which happens. But I think that current circumstances lead us to think that circumstances are better for them to be more operational. So that's the positive side. And I'd like to say a few words then, as requested, on Gulf of Guinea and coordinated maritime presences. Firstly, and to respond to the question about the Portuguese Navy, we are significantly increasing our naval capacity under our national military programming law. because of this recognition of the importance of the growing importance of the Atlantic and growing contestedness. We have currently a vessel which is permanently stationed in São Tomé and Príncipe, and it is quite regularly called out to help combat piracy. At least twice, if not 3 times this year, this has happened. And I think its simple presence in the region has helped to deter attacks, at least in that specific neighborhood. We have we have also the tradition of sending vessels down twice a year, once each semester, down the coast, visiting ports, establishing relations with other navies, and helping to safeguard the security of that region. And this will now change a little bit with the coordinated maritime presences. Coordinated maritime presences, for those who are not familiar with this new concept, involves simply taking the national maritime presences of European member states in the region of the Gulf of Guinea. We're starting with a pilot project in the Gulf of Guinea, and to coordinate them. In other words, to coordinate the calendars when they go there. Currently, each navy establishes its calendar according to its own criteria without reference to others. So the calendarization of shipping in the naval patrols in the region will be established so that we have, as far as possible, a permanent presence. Secondly, each ship that is in the region then passes on situational information to the next ship coming into the region, so that you will have a shared and growing body of information that is shared amongst the ships of the European Union member states. And if we are successful in this, we will have, on the one hand, a more or less permanent presence in the region, which should be significant in terms of deterrence, and we should have also a much greater understanding of the level of illicit activities in the region. If we are successful, then we can take the same experiment to other parts of the world. I would also add that it is a very significant contribution to giving the European Union a maritime dimension to its defense identity. The defense identity of the European Union has been lacking a maritime dimension. So we will be contributing to this, of course, with our ships that go there regularly in any case, and we will be teaming up with the ships of France, Spain, Italy, other navies that go there. Of course, in the European Union, this is understood in a more immediate sense by the countries that have a coastline and a naval tradition. But there, I would say that there is a growing awareness in the European Union of the need for us to be investing in maritime security. Put it another way, there's a growing understanding that maritime security is increasingly under pressure, and do we need to make a contribution to stabilization of maritime regions. So those are the comments I wanted to make on the coordinated maritime presences. I would also like to take this opportunity to add another aspect that we are working on, which is the creation of an Atlantic Center. Atlantic Center designed, this is the name that we've called it, designed to bring together the countries of the Atlantic, and there are about 60 of them, at 3 levels. At the level of political dialogue, this is non-existent. There is no instance in which, no institutional framework in which countries of the Atlantic come together. We are obviously thinking about the 4 quarters of the Atlantic, the north and the south, and the east and the west. Again, this is innovative because the focus is on our side, European side, has been on the North Atlantic, but increasingly there is an understanding that it just makes no sense to be dividing up the Atlantic. The Atlantic needs to be understood as a full region. and as a region as a whole. So one level is political dialogue. A second level, the level of think tanks, helping us to identify trends, problems, challenges that we need to be focusing on. And the third level, which is the capacity building, particularly focused on countries of the African coastline that have difficulty in patrolling their waters and maintaining safety and stability in their own waters. If we are successful with this Atlantic Center, and I've had very good feedback from many of my counterparts that I've been speaking with, including, for example, the South African Defense Minister, with whom I had a very interesting video conference just a few weeks ago, and a manifestation of interest in participating in this. If we are successful in this, then I think we can be creating something that is of relevance for the wider Atlantic community, and that we can begin to think of ourselves as an Atlantic community, something that has been somewhat absent from our strategic thinking.
Minister, is there a schedule for that Atlantic Center?
We've actually already held. Of course, unfortunately, COVID has slowed us down. Otherwise, we would be up and running. But we've held two seminars at the level of people who think about the Atlantic, and that has been very useful in terms of shaping our initiative. So they're really foundational seminars where we brought together people from 15, 17 different countries to help us think through the concept. And we want to start in May with the first capacity building course, and with the signature of a memorandum of understanding between a dozen or so of the founding member states. We would like to widen the participation as much as possible, but you have to start with those who are most committed at an early stage. So we expect to have a memorandum of understanding signed by a dozen or so. So in this first semester, with the first capacity building course already in this first semester.
Very well. International cooperation proves to be fundamental when it comes to maritime security and freedom of navigation. Leendert, which EU bodies are working on this, and what kind of support, for instance, does EMSA offers for the Mediterranean Sea?
Thank you very much for the question. If I again can just show very few slides to illustrate that point. So if we go immediately to the next slide, then actually in the European Union we have a more horizontal policy, which is called the European Union Maritime Security Strategy. The European Maritime Security Strategy, as you can see, okay, there's too much text for you to read maybe, but it highlights exactly the issues that I think have been raised by all the panelists together. So there's a very horizontal approach, which is, let's say, good and bad at the same time. It is good because it recognizes all types of security threats that we have. It also gives a good focus also where the organizations in the EU should cooperate. But it does not have a very specific regional focus. So also you cannot find anything specific for the Mediterranean Sea or for the Indian Ocean or for whatever reason. So it is good and bad, but it helps us to identify the issues in the maritime domain. And I think that is important. And of course, I am extremely biased, but I'm very happy if I hear the Minister say that he wants to boost the maritime dimension and the maritime identity of the European Union. Because indeed, that is lacking. There, I think we can do much more with what we already have today, which was also mentioned. So if I go to my next slide, then you can see that a number of EU-based agencies are working also in the Mediterranean Sea to tackle the issues that I have illustrated in my first intervention. EFCA, our colleagues in Vigo, they are concentrating on fisheries monitoring. Then we have the military operation EUNAVFOR IRINI, as it's called now, to deal with regular migration. We have our colleagues from Frontex to deal with border control. Europol, police cooperation, certainly also cross-border crime. And then Mark N, which is intergovernmental cooperation between a number of EU countries looking at interception of drug transports towards the EU. They all need, all those governmental organizations need to understand what is happening at sea. And there is where our agency is stepping in. So we provide a maritime picture or situational awareness. There are a number of fancy words of expressing it. What is happening at sea? Where are the ships? Where is the human activity? And for that, we are collecting a lot of information and distributing that to all those that have an interest from a governmental perspective to see what is happening at sea worldwide. If I go to my next slide, then this is, of course, as my theme today was the Mediterranean Sea. You see an illustration of the Mediterranean Sea where, let's say, those big stripes are the satellite images that we take from the whole region. And all those small dots in blue and yellow and black, there are different data sources from which we collect ship positions. And all that data we are redistributing to our colleagues in other fields of operation. So you don't necessarily have to work in maritime to get our data, but also if you work in fisheries or in defense or in customs or in law enforcement, then you will be able to get this information from us, which is helpful because you don't duplicate efforts in that field. At the moment, we are, for example, collecting 35 million individual ship positions per day using AIS, VMS, and LRIT, for example. So, and that we all fuse in the maritime picture, which is always the foundation to any action at sea which is possible, because you need to have eyes to understand where you need to put your effort from whatever perspective. If I go to my next slide, and I will keep it short, just to illustrate a bit what we do based on satellite images, complementing our vessel positions. Last year, we have delivered to EU governments 15,000 satellite images, of which 4,000 were taken over the Mediterranean Sea. And here you see a bit the variation. So the blue, which is the biggest part, is our Clean SeaNet service, which is for pollution detection, which we also do at the Atlantic, by the way. The pink ones are specific requests for border control, mainly for Frontex, dus to see where irregular migration is happening. And then in green, that is the Copernicus Maritime Surveillance Service that we are offering, can be for any law enforcement activity from different organizations. So here again, you see the kind of combination of a lot of information that is shared amongst authorities. And if you may skip the next slide and go to the last, that's why I was stepping a bit outside of my Mediterranean Sea for a moment. This is, for example, what we have been doing in the Gulf of Guinea over the last 2-3 years. Also providing information, for example, to the Portuguese Navy that has been operating there from time to time, to the Italian, French Navy, also to UNODC when they do training activities in the region. So there we try to use the capabilities that we have built worldwide to help those organizations that try to make a difference in this very difficult region, also in the Mediterranean. So that's why I was also interested, and I apologize for my very first question to the Minister. But of course, we are very keen to help out wherever we can with the capabilities that we have for the EU interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kaitlin, of course, we have been talking about attacks and piracy and violence and the way to the international cooperation to tackle with these issues. But as this conference focuses on oceans and as well on climate action, let me ask you if there are in the ASEAN region, if there are increased challenges for maritime law enforcement given the threats of climate change. If climate change is playing an important role in the challenges for maritime enforcement.
Thank you so much. And I'd also just like to briefly comment on what the Minister said about the coordinated maritime presence. As UNODC, we're not a naval force, but we are actively working alongside such initiatives in the Gulf of Guinea, supporting actually the legislation that would eventually allow for piracy suspects to be prosecuted, which is a key element that's been lacking in the Gulf of Guinea region, and one that, well, there were some creative results in East Africa when the piracy challenge was there. And also thank you to both the Portuguese Navy and EMSA, because we do have great cooperation in the Gulf of Guinea, including cooperation, as was mentioned, on maritime exercises, which are great for capacity building within partner nations in the region. But on the question of climate change, it's actually a new issue that we've been looking at, and we carried out some research specifically with Pacific Island nations, but I think it would be relevant more globally also. And this is to ask the question, what would the effects on law enforcement be given the potential of climate change? So climate change, it might cause erosion, changes of coastlines, it might change the biodiversity in the oceans, and it also might mean that there are new regulations that are going to be set up, protecting more maritime zones or having more regulations related to pollution at sea, for example. Our research found that this would probably have quite an increase on what we might term broadly as blue crimes at sea. There'll be more economic impacts on coastal populations, affecting tourism and fishing. There'll be perhaps food security issues related to coastal populations. There may be emerging maritime border disputes as coastlines change, maybe increased migration pressures. So a lot of sort of new drivers that maritime law enforcers will have to deal with. The conclusion of our investigation into this issue posits that climate change will likely cause more work and harder conditions for maritime law enforcers. It might affect directly their assets, their buildings, their docks, electricity, basic things like that might be washed away at low coastlines. It might also affect their operational capacity if depths change, if vessels are not able to get into certain areas, shallower waters, and they will have more work to do if there is more regulation or enforcement of crimes being committed at sea. In addition, it was mentioned before, with severe weather patterns, there might be more work for maritime law enforcers to be carrying out search and rescue and related operations. So this is, as I said, it's not our primary area of work, but as we are, our mandate is to support our member states to be prepared to combat maritime crime. This is something that we'll increasingly be focusing on in our work.
Moreover, because the social impact of climate change can also help or foster the mobilization of local communities to piracy.
Yes, or other forms of crime, ways to make money that might emerge depending on the region or what other crime trends might be present in the region. Certainly,
it's a good point to turn to the coast of Mozambique again, and Tim. Pedro Gonçalves is asking is it possible that the armed groups that are operating in Cabo Delgado may be receiving support, fighters, weapons by sea?
It's very probable that they are, or if they are not yet in any substantial way, that it is a potential route or means to actually be exploited in the future. The routes which dhows and transshipment, and all sorts of, untrackable. I think back to what we just saw from the EMSA sort of pictures that Leendert was showing. So much of the traffic, is not going to carry a lot of AIS or LRIT or is trackable in many respects as well. And there's not a lot of eyes or, as we heard as well, maritime domain awareness, which is often able to inform what the deployment of very limited naval assets. So even if, we can pick up a lot of suspicious traffic, sometimes it's just very hard to actually deploy or intercept these kind of operations. And it always brings me back to a point of thinking that because if you take the example of the question raised of what's happening in Mozambique, is that the connections or the potential of somebody who could be supplying the insurgency in Mozambique doesn't necessarily have to stop at that, by which I mean that the borders, the landing sites throughout this part of the Mozambique Channel, all the way down to South Africa, is relatively open. These routes are well established. They go back many times centuries as well. And I'm not saying that they've always carried, say criminal contraband or have a corrupting influence, but they can be exploited, as Kaitlin just said as well. They're very susceptible to corruption or being integrated into these kind of networks. And to be honest as well, the level of grievances is always on the increase as well. The isolation of so many coastal communities, the pressures that they are under quite often as well, is not being addressed by either the central government or by the most visible symbols of companies who are coming in, be it gas companies or be it some kind of NGO as well. A lot of this is, I just bring it back to the climate change issue as well. Climate change is absolutely critical, fundamental to what is going on, especially I believe in places like Tanzania, in Mozambique, basically throughout coastal Africa as well. You're going to see, I believe, an increase in populations in coastal areas. Coastal resources are going to come under significantly more pressure, and that could be because of again, what we've heard just now as well, coastal migration. That could be caused by climate change further inland. It could be caused by conflict over limited resources further inland, pushing people to the seas. We've seen that in Mozambique with the huge numbers of internally displaced people seeking refuge in coastal towns like Pemba and Palma. You've got this situation then where you've really got to consider how will people feed themselves, especially if there are limited resources due to illegal fishing or because of bleaching and the loss of biodiversity, sea temperature rises as well, and the fact that so many people are maybe seeking to fish, that there are very destructive practices as well. Now that's not to blame, as I say, the people who are there. It places an obligation, I believe, on good marine spatial planning, if I can try and draw it into what we've heard from the previous presentations as well, about the usage of coastal space and how it is politically aligned with either the principles of good governance of the state or of the regional communities, and how that is stressed as well, because you might end up with a situation too where you have huge amounts of coastal areas being in a way cleared in the name of potential tourism sites, for instance, and that's not a very viable future when you, like I say, have increasing numbers of people seeking refuge for climate change reasons, for conflict reasons, in coastal areas. And that, I think, is a major trend track in the short to medium, basically up into the long term as well. But some of the tools we've been looking at today are going to play a crucial part in that, if it's about tracking or being able to track ships and use that intelligence to deploy, like I said, very limited assets, but limited assets which could be pooled and combined. The example of the frigate in Sao Tome and Principe is a really good example as well, I think, of how do we use these limited assets in a way which benefits the entire region. And it's quite exciting to be talking about this today as well, because, and the final thing I'll say, because I know I perhaps explaining the answer as well, but the work of the UNODC, especially in West Africa, in terms of the legislation and the support and the capacity building is crucial there. There are so many, well, there are many instruments for states or member states or communities to draw upon. I feel that they're just often not aware of them enough, or the benefits of that enough. And I think that's a good communication role or function for organizations like the African Union going forward as well. I think they have a very crucial role to play there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. Minister, it's very important what it seems to me, at least, what Tim Walker has just said. But when we come to the way how the foreign nav is organized, for instance, in the case of Mozambique, it looks like it's very much based on assistance to army, to land forces, and not so much to develop the maritime defense capacities, isn't it?
Ricardo Alexandre, were you addressing the question to me?
Yes.
Or,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well,
since we heard last week that you finally mentioned the number of Portuguese military that are going to train in Mozambique, 65, as I believe, but mainly to assist the Mozambican special forces.
Yeah, but special forces actually including the fuzileiros, which are the Marines. So, but yes, in general, you are absolutely right. I have to say though two things. One is that when we engage with Mozambique, we engage with full respect for the sovereign authorities of that country, and we respond to what they consider to be the priorities, and so that the focus has been on those land aspects, although, as I say, with marine training as well. Second aspect is that I know that France and Mozambique are also in discussion about work that they can do together in terms of maritime security. French have 2 naval ships in Réunion Island, and so they're frequently going down by the coast of Madagascar, the Mozambique Channel, and they can work more closely with Mozambique, and they're engaging with Mozambique and discussing this at the moment. So it's not entirely absent. But more generally, I'd like to pick up on the absolute importance, because I've been speaking about what we as Europeans can do, but the absolute importance of engaging with countries of coastal regions and the organizations. So for West Africa already, there is an architect, the so-called Yaoundé architecture, which is established by the countries of the region. And what we want to do with the coordinated maritime presence is to engage with the Yaoundé architecture, not to do something completely separate and unrelated, but to engage with institutional frameworks that can already exist. That's why when we have our Ministers of Defense meeting of the European Union in the beginning of May, on the 4th of May, we have taken the initiative of inviting the Friends of the Gulf of Guinea, G7++. So it's a group which is composed out of G7 countries and countries of the region of the Gulf of Guinea, and currently chaired by the United Kingdom and Senegal, and co-chaired. And we're inviting them to discuss with EU defense ministers what we should be doing together so we can explain our coordinated maritime presences, so we can hear from them about the experience of the Yaoundé architecture and work out how we can be making sure that our actions are coming together as they should, rather than being separate. A final brief point to say that, of course, as Minister of Defense, I'm focusing on the security aspects, but the oceans as a whole, and my colleagues on this panel will be very much aware of this, they need for us to have an approach which is integrated, which involves the security aspect, but it involves also environmental sustainability, it involves the economic dynamics, the creation of opportunities for the blue economy, etc. So during our presidency of the EU, we're organizing in Lisbon a large conference on the oceans in June, which aims to bring together these different dimensions, which are dealt with by different groups of people, and that need greater integration in the way that we think about the oceans.
Thank you very much. Leendert, José Araújo asks which measures should be set up to deal with human trafficking by sea.
It sounds like an almost impossible question. How to bring peace to the world? No. No, well, I think we see the issue in different kinds, also in other regions. That, of course, I think Tim was referring to that. There, where there's, let's say, scarcity of resources, it will start to drive people away. Certainly, when there's even conflict about the resources, even there you will have even more refugees going away. And that, of course, is a big fundamental and structural problem that we have. The unrest around Europe with the ongoing fights and insecurity in Syria, the ongoing kind of turmoil in Libya, unstable regimes elsewhere, where there's also a lot of criticism towards the sitting governments, the Arab Spring that did not really bring what people were expecting from it, drives people away. And then still, of course, Europe is seen as the prosperous neighbor. So it requires a long-term engagement of Europe in Africa, mainly, to help to structure, to restructure, to bring health and prosperity in that region. And at the same time, we have to set up a sensible mechanism at our doorsteps to help people, but also to be realistic what we can do and what we cannot do. And these are very difficult political choices to be made. And I think Europe is already struggling with finding the answer to this question since 2015, with varying results, positive and negative. And there you always see the balance between kind of strict border control, but also not losing the human face. And there is again about balance. So we need to be prepared. We need to be present. I think we also need to invest in those coastal states. I think that we can also host people not only in Europe, but also before they enter Europe, for example, dealing with asylum procedures. So I think there is a whole toolbox necessary to address this. It's a rather complex issue. And we should also be careful not to be associated with either the positive side or the negative side of it, because multiple actions are required to deal with this problem, which will not go away. Certainly also we talk about climate change, about scarce resources. For the years to come, we will have to deal with it. And so I think also from a political point of view, and I'm not a politician in this panel, maybe luckily so, we need to find a kind of balanced approach, working on development aid, good border control, human rights, all in the right mixture. Thank you.
Thank you, Leendert. Kaitlin, I do not really know if this is very accurate, but I tend to believe that in illicit trafficking, new drugs, at least sometimes, demand new routes. And regarding methamphetamines, there is an increasing importance of the so-called golden triangle. What could you tell us about that?
Sorry, just wanted to share my screen to touch on this briefly, because it is an interesting trend both for the region but also globally. And this relates to the fact that the Golden Triangle, which has historically been an area of production for opium poppy bordering Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, has now emerged as one of the global epicenters for synthetic drugs production. It's really facilitated because there are porous borders around them and really easy access to all of the precursor chemicals that allows you to make these drugs. And you can see from the, I think is a really interesting comparison of these two maps that show how concerned countries in the region are of methamphetamine. And it went from very few countries to almost all of the countries in the region. And this is considering that most of the consumption is actually happening internationally, but is having a really big effect also regionally. The law enforcement challenge is a significant one and relates to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about already, including people being willing to go to sea, having good maritime domain awareness, and having the ability to send limited assets if vessels are found. And what is happening is that there's this Western maritime route that's emerged. And the challenge, particularly for law enforcers, is that traffickers are using motherships. Well, they will pack big quantities of methamphetamine pills, which can be very tiny. Then they can shut off their transponders. They can sit outside of territorial waters for days or even weeks. And then using daughter ships, smaller ships, they might also be fishing vessels that can mix really easily into the environment, will transport the drugs to buyer ships that are coming from various areas along the coastline. And that might be a handover at a predetermined spot, or they might drop the drugs on a fishing buoy, for example, some of the old methods for transporting illegal substances. The coastal states that are along the routes are not necessarily the destination points, but they have seen significant upticks in use. And they're being used as transit points, not only for the region, but also the broader world. The region is trying to respond. I think one element we haven't spoken about yet is interagency cooperation at the national level, which is always also a challenge. In this particular case, it means having the narcotics control agencies and the maritime law enforcers exchanging information and working together, and that can always be a bit of a challenge. And further cooperation at the regional level, and that's something that our program is trying to assist. We've set up a forum for the coastal states to be able to better coordinate responses and share information on this particular new and emerging trend, which I do, as I said, think has a regional significance, but also an international one. Thanks.
Thank you. Timothy, would you say that, not thinking only about the coast of Mozambique and the Indian Ocean, but on a broader sense, would you say that the multilateral approaches to deal with the safety of the oceans have been effective?
They do struggle with their effectiveness, and sometimes their coherence and coordination, it leaves a little bit to be desired, it's true. But often it's useful to remember, I think, that many member states who participate in these arrangements have gone in with very limited either capabilities or assets or a strong kind of national interest in getting something out of these organizations. So they do have an interest in regional stability. I'm thinking here in terms of the counter-piracy initiatives, where despite all coastal states in the Western Indian Ocean being, especially the small island states like Seychelles and Mauritius, being very vulnerable in terms of what they could bring to the table or put in or could contribute in terms of funding, that's often meant that the organizations were very dependent on other states, larger states who might already have competing interests as well. So the institutions which are established do struggle with the buy-in of the member states, I find. I think the institutions of secretariats or commissions are not often capacitated enough to drive the agenda in a way which can bring all state parties together to discuss these matters. There'll be a lot of disputes over, and something which I think it's crucially always over kind of integrated into our discussion here, which is reconciling ideas of sovereignty, especially ideas of sovereignty which are usually focused on controlling of land borders or about how land issues are governed, with maritime zones and laws and ideas which are very, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with, of course, but the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and how you can, the obligations, the responsibilities, but also the benefits of engaging in that regime are beyond many member states, because say they don't have a sustained history of engagement with, like say, building navies, cooperation, and in Africa state as well. You've got to remember the kind of very recent post-colonial history is still quite a recent phenomenon, and especially when it comes to maritime issues, where there's never been a substantial navy in many states or a maritime gendarmerie or kind of ministry. These are relatively recent institutions and still battling with so many other issues as well. So I like say it can be frustrating sometimes to try and judge the results of organizations like the African Union or the Southern African Development Community, but always just to bear in mind that, that they do have a very substantial institutional kind of blockage, which is preventing them from acting in a way which is similar to organizations maybe like the European Union. But that increases the importance of partnerships, of lessons learned, of coordination. And I think experience sharing, particularly between the European Union and the African Union in terms of maritime safety or surveillance, or if it's in terms of blue economy, is actually going to bring everybody up. It's that old expression of a rising tide lifts all ships. I think that would be very applicable in this situation were that to occur.
Thank you, Tim. I think Minister Cravinho could answer this one from Eva Tomaziewska. She asks, how would you comment on the impact of Brexit on the cooperation in the area of the maritime security? And she mentions coordinated presences in the Gulf of Guinea and the MAOC N, which I had to look up on Google, I must admit, the Maritime Analysis and the Operations Center for Narcotics. Basically, what's the impact of Brexit in the maritime security?
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, the United Kingdom is a major naval power. Great Britain has been a major naval power for many centuries. And in fact, the British Empire was built on the basis of naval power. So Brexit represents for the European Union the loss of a major maritime nation. Having said that, I think that the United Kingdom's defense and interests do not take it away from the European Union. They're very similar. And the United Kingdom is, I think, in due course, very likely to establish mechanisms for regular coordination with the European Union. Obviously, the United Kingdom is a member of NATO, and 21 member states of the European Union are in NATO. So there's a lot of coordination between EU member states and the UK in NATO and bilaterally. And I think in terms of something like the coordinated maritime presences, well, it's up to the UK, but it's not difficult to imagine that at some future point in the Gulf of Guinea or in another geography that there could be collaboration. So I don't see that in terms of maritime security, it's going to make a major change. We're still on the same side and concerned about the same issues, and therefore destined, I would say, to coordinate and cooperate with each other. With respect to MAOC, based here in Lisbon, it makes very important substantive contributions to the combat of narco trafficking. It's not an area that I deal with. It deals more with the Ministry of Justice, operationally, of course, sometimes the information coming from MAOC is used to ask the Portuguese Navy to intercept a vessel on the high seas, and that has happened regularly and produced very significant results in terms of hauls of particularly cocaine cargo. But it's an institution that I think should be more well known because of the significant contribution that it makes to combating narco traffic. And I'm sure that my co-panelists here from EMSA and Leendert Bal from EMSA and Kaitlin Meredith from UNODC are very much familiar with the work of MAOC.
Thank you very much, Minister João Gomes Cravinho, também to Kaitlin Meredith, Timothy Walker, Leendert Bal. I'd like to thank you all for your brilliant interventions. The next session of this conference will be at 9 a.m. GMT tomorrow, 9 horas in the morning, with a panel, The Blue Economy Beyond Fish and Minerals. I wish you all a very pleasant evening. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you have a good evening too.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.